You might be taking counterfeit weight loss drugs. The semaglutide weight loss drug Ozempic has brought hope to those struggling with obesity and diabetes, but all the Ozempic rage over the past few years has sparked global shortages of the drug and sky-high prices. A federal Food and Drug Administration investigation found that boxes of thousands of counterfeit Ozempic pens arrived at a packaging site in New York in the end of 2023. The pens had needles that looked different from the original ones. The small label on each pen was askew. And while each box should have been marked with a unique serial number, they all had the same one.
Since then, many of those pens have been sold. 6 months later, the question becomes, where did those doses go and where did they come from? The FDA investigation into these boxes remains ongoing. Journalist and Vanity Fair contributor Katherine Eban has investigated the underground gray market surrounding Ozempic-like drugs and is here with us now to discuss. Thanks for coming on.
Great to be with you.
So is it possible that these drugs were made by a manufacturer trying to produce a generic Ozempic? It's my understanding that the patent has been called into question by some U.S. lawmakers. Does this questioning of the patent have anything to do with potentially other people trying to prematurely make a generic Ozempic? And how did they get sold?
Well, the patent battle that I chronicle in the story actually took place in China. And that is where the patent was temporarily suspended and then reinstated. Now, the question is, where did these pens between 10,000 to 20,000 units of Ozempic come from? They were almost perfect counterfeits, except that they, instead of having a unique serial number on each box, they had a repeating serial number. That was the biggest clue that they were counterfeit. Over the course of a 6-month investigation, I tracked those pens to China. It appears that's where they originated.
And where did they end up getting sold to? Were they sold to individual customers, to pharmacies? I imagine this is quite scary for people to hear that China is introducing these untested drugs into the market.
It is extremely scary. So, I think most consumers understand that if they're ordering pharmaceuticals from the internet, if they are taking a bus ride to Mexico to get low-cost drugs or drugs that are in shortage, those are what I describe as buyer beware purchases. What made this counterfeiting episode so alarming is that the pens breached the legitimate U.S. drug supply, which is supposed to be very tightly regulated. So somehow, and obviously this is still being investigated, these pens wound up at legitimate licensed U.S. wholesalers, one of them in Elmira, New York. They were on sale within the U.S. drug supply. Apparently they did reach some patients, they did reach pharmacies. The question becomes, how can that happen?
Now, it's interesting to hear that they were potentially stocked in pharmacies, or at least in, a drug supply where you have to go through legitimate channels of getting a prescription to gain access to these drugs, which is not what we usually see in the illicit economy in terms of drug sales. So is there going to be any criminal investigation into potentially the wholesalers who are responsible for tracking the flow and source of the drugs that they ultimately get to market?
Well, I can't say exactly what law enforcement is looking at, but there is definitely an ongoing criminal investigation from, FDA, Office of Criminal Investigation, as well as the Federal Bureau of Investigations. The question is, who in the U.S. paid for drugs that obviously violated numerous U.S. laws in being imported into the country? We do know that FDA has informed Congress that they are investigating the smuggling of these drugs into U.S. ports of entry. I was able to investigate a number of the wholesalers and other entities that are named on the documents that we exclusively obtained that accompanied these drugs through the supply chain.
And you write in your story, Katherine, that you were looking at some of this problem with the counterfeit drug market back in the early 2000s and found a lot of ways that the system fails to filter out these drugs that in many cases come from very experienced counterfeiters and even members of drug cartels south of the border. Has anything changed since then that has led situations like this to become less likely, less common? Or have the counterfeiters really just gotten better at their job?
Those are all really good questions. So for 3 years, I followed a group of pharmacists and cops in South Florida who were on the trail of a domestic counterfeiter. That book, Dangerous Doses, came out in 2005. Since that time, there has been a very important law, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, which was passed, which requires basically an electronic pedigree for all these drugs as they move through the system. That presumably would prevent this kind of counterfeiting incident because anybody in the supply chain could see these drugs are not legitimate, they're not supposed to be moving through the system. But believe it or not, that law is still not fully implemented. And so drugs are accompanied by paper pedigrees. And guess what? Criminals can just make stuff up on this paper. So, we really still have a drug supply that is dangerously exposed to these problems.
And so when I imagine the type of person who might be making these counterfeit drugs, Ozempic's obviously extremely popular. It's a growing industry right now. And the insulin industry was profitable for quite some time, but with additional policy restrictions on how much a pharmaceutical company can charge for insulin, which is necessary for a lot of people who have diabetes to live a normal, healthy life. Now, what does it mean that there's so much pressure on people trying to make money off of this, people trying to sell it? Is it the type of person you imagine that's making counterfeit drugs where it's like a small crime ring and it's not very sophisticated? Or are you imagining that it could be a legitimate pharmaceutical company? I know you've covered in the past, how quality the generic drugs we get in the store are compared to brand name. Could it be a legitimate pharmaceutical company producing this counterfeit Ozempic?
I would say to you, it's really all of the above. I mean, there have been instances of one-off counterfeiting where counterfeiters, sort of low-grade counterfeiters, are taking insulin pens and relabeling them to make them look like Ozempic for resale. But you also have the rise of transnational crime groups that are involved in these counterfeiting schemes. And the counterfeiting episode, which is really industrial scale that I chronicle in my article, is obviously very sophisticated. I mean, the boxes were almost exact. The lot that they counterfeited on the label, NAR 0074, was actually a real Ozempic lot number. And in fact, the material inside of the pens actually was semaglutide. But the dose wasn't precise. So, the question is, did somebody in China who was already making this active ingredient resort to a very sophisticated counterfeiting scheme, possibly with the collusion of U.S. wholesalers or U.S. criminals? We don't know the answers to that, but it's a very sophisticated thing. This is not just somebody counterfeiting Ozempic in their bathtub or their garage.
Read your investigation over at Vanity Fair. It's very thorough. Thank you so much for joining us on Rising today to help us suss out some of the details.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.